Have you ever found yourself in a place where pain was all you could focus on? Do you ever question God's plan while dealing with physical suffering? Or do you ever get to the point where you just want the pain to end and you don't know what to do? Then I'm so glad you're with us today. This episode is for you. Today, we are going to be talking about when chronic pain becomes too much to bear. Welcome back to another episode of Your Hope-Filled Perspective, where it's always our goal to restore hope, renew minds, and empower listeners to live in their God-given identity. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson, and I'm so grateful you're here. If you are one of the many who suffers from chronic physical pain, I wonder if you've ever asked, how do I keep my hope alive when I'm hurting? And how can I focus on renewing my mind when the only thing I can think about is the pain? And how do we continue to live in our God-given identity when pain feels all-consuming and it's like that's what we're known for? That's why today we're going to be talking about when chronic pain becomes too much. But I want to encourage you before we start this episode that those who know, love, and trust God never need to worry that God is unaware of their suffering or that your requests for relief are being ignored. Now, how do I know that? It's because I go back to the truth of Scripture based in Luke 12, verses 6-7, that says, "Are not sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Yet not one of them is forgotten by God. Indeed, the very hairs on your head are numbered. Don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows." Now, many of you know that I've written and released a new book, The Hem of His Garment, Reaching Out to God When Pain Overwhelms. This book is not just written for those who are overwhelmed by physical pain. It also reaches those who are touched by emotional pain, relational pain, financial pain, spiritual pain, secondary pain inflicted by others, as well as grief and loss. But in this series, where we're going to be discussing the different types of pain, I felt like it was prudent that we start off the conversation with the most well-known type of pain, and that is physical pain. We've all been there. We've all scabbed our knee or been burnt by the sun or broke a leg, so we can relate. But not all of us can relate to chronic pain. So to have this conversation today, my friend Laurie Davies is joining our conversation. She's a fellow writer and speaker in the Phoenix area, where she's also serves as a lay counselor and an area ministry lead. When it's not triple digits, and today it's supposed to hit 117, then she's usually out with her husband hiking in the mountains. Laurie, I'm so glad that you've joined the conversation today, because I know that this is one that you can personally relate to.
I can. It's a topic none of us really does want to relate to, but I can relate. Thanks for having me on.
I'm glad that you're here. Today, we're talking about when chronic pain becomes too much. Will you share a little bit about the physical pain that has seemed too much for you to bear?
I will. I am a double spinal fusion patient. So my neck is held together by screws and pins. I was in a car crash years and years ago. So I got some pretty good years after that crash before the pain really set in. But my neck I had 2 back-to-back spinal fusions. And on the second fusion, when I woke up, my doctor was trying to explain what he had done. And I was kind of awake, but kind of not. And I said, I'm going to need you to say that again in language I can get right now. And he said, do you remember that game Operation we played when we were kids? I just played that in your neck for 4 hours, but the red nose didn't buzz. So that was the good news. But he literally had to pluck disc fragments out of a nerve root, which has left me with a neck that by and large works in my day-to-day life. No one would really know I'm in pain. But truly, Michelle, in my day-to-day life, I'm anywhere from a pain level 3 to a 10.
And that's part of the reason that I wanted to have you on, because you and I can relate on that level. And yet it's interesting to me that you said most people would never know. And that's what
Mm.
most people say about me. And I think that's true for many pain sufferers. We put a smile on our face, we go to work, or we go in about our ministry efforts, or we take care of our children. And by and large, a lot of people would never know. But that's why I want to bring this conversation to light about chronic pain, because many, many people suffer, and it's an issue that we need to be talking about.
Yeah, I hope we'll get into that a little bit later. The no one would know, because I really want your listeners and your viewers to know it's not fake. It's not like we're walking through life with some Pollyanna
Oh, no.
denial that suffering is real, but it is a choice. But
Yes.
I don't want to hijack the rest of the conversation. I want to actually ask you what kind of pain you deal with on a day-to-day basis or a week-to-week basis.
When I was 3 years old, I experienced a life-threatening illness, had a fever of 107, and doctors were just concerned that we needed to get the fever down so that I didn't die or have brain damage. But long story short, they ended up doing all the measures that they could to try to get that fever down, and nothing worked. And so they suggest that my parents give me aspirin. What they did not know is that I had a life-threatening allergy to aspirin. And so I went into anaphylactic shock. And as a result of the aspirin invading my body and my body trying to reject it, I have physical deformity, and I've got a 2-inch leg length difference between my left leg and my right leg. And my right ankle and toes are all fused because of a severe physical deformity. If you've ever seen pictures of the Chinese children whose feet are bound so that they don't get any bigger, they kind of look like an upside down triangle. That is what my foot looks like. And so since I was 3 years old, every single step I take every day hurts. But I also deal with chronic migraines, and I deal with bone on bone in my neck. And so looking to the left or the right or up or down or working at a computer or driving somewhere increases my pain level.
All
So
the things you do every day.
all the things you do every day, and you can't choose not to. And it was interesting because when the publisher came to me and asked, would you consider writing a book on pain? In all honesty, Laurie, I found myself thinking, I didn't say this, but I found myself thinking, no, no,
I
because
get that.
I know the pain that I'm going to have to walk through to write a book on pain to help other people. But it didn't take too long in my conversations with the Lord. I felt like he was saying, well, either you can do it or I'll have someone else do it. And I wanted to be obedient more than I wanted to be comfortable. So that's why I
That's
said, yeah.
beautiful. The cost of the ticket to that dance is high, but thank you for being obedient. Could I ask you about your book?
Sure.
I'd love to know why you wrote it. You stepped out in obedience to do it, but I'd like to hear the why behind why you wrote it.
I've gone through a lot in my life, and my listeners have heard about a lot of our different life circumstances, between my husband having cancer and losing my mom, and lots of different trials and tribulations. But nothing has been as severe in a day-to-day fashion as dealing with chronic pain.
Mm.
And as I've walked through it, Laurie, there have been so many days, and I don't know if you can relate to this, but so many days when the pain was at a 10 plus. And I just thought, God, where are you in this?
Yeah.
And God, I know you can heal. Why aren't you healing?
Right.
God, are you mad at me? Or in my professional world, God, are you done with me? And I've had to wrestle with that in my faith. And I come to a place through walking through this pain that I didn't want anybody else to walk through this journey without feeling like they had a hand to hold.
Yeah, those questions are hard questions.
They are.
I can remember reading, so pain level 10, I think pain level 10, you find it when you find it. Like you think when you broke your ankle in high school, that's a pain level 10. And then you go through, in my case, spinal fusion. You know, I was bone on bone and I had nerves that were just camped on. Even today, I can't don't have feeling in my fingers. I've aggravated my neck injury again, and it's a constant battle. But anyway, I can remember one day when I was in a pain level 10 reading, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." And Michelle, I didn't want sufficient grace. I wanted relief.
Right.
And God, where are you? And will I always live like this?
Right.
Can I live like this? You know, there's some pain is a dark valley, and in a dark valley, dark questions accompany. And so wrestling through that, I think, is it can be pain makes our world smaller. It can be very lonely. We can feel abandoned by God. And yet, I know this to be true. The word says, "When I am afraid, I will trust in you." Another translation says, "When I am afraid, I will put my trust in you." And when I think about that, trust sounds like a precious commodity that we can put somewhere. And when I put it in God, who is the best thing going for us,
Right.
He does pull me through those hard days. I can put my trust in a doctor. I can trust my doctor for good news, but when I trust in God, who is good, I get to a better result, and I get through the pain of the day better.
Yeah. But in that dark valley, I think so often we come to the place, it's almost like spiritual dissonance, where we think, I know God is good, but golly, I hurt so bad. Is he good in my situation?
Right.
And that's where I think we really have to go back to what we know to be true about God, because what I know to be true about pain is that pain lies to us. And pain makes us very susceptible to the lies of the enemy.
Yeah, I hope we'll get into that too, because I definitely have some thoughts on that. I want to ask you, I mean, I'm like taking over your podcast here. I used to be a journalist, so I can't help myself, but I'd like to put my journalist hat on and ask you, because I have had well-intentioned people who look at my pain level and think, you know, maybe it's uncomfortable. I'm just going to say it. Maybe I've done something wrong, or maybe God has abandoned me because he's mad at me. I have not personally had the, you know, maybe I'm outside God's will, but I have had friends who suffer from pain who actually have had that kind of statement aimed at them. Maybe you're in pain because you're outside God's will. So I'm going to kind of put you on the spot, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I've had people say things like that. I've had questions like that. But Laurie, before I wrote this book, I spent a good 2 years with Job as my best friend.
That's a hard best friend.
It is a hard best friend. And I didn't like the book of Job very well for that first year. But the very first verse in Job 1 says that Job was blameless and upright before God. And yet God said, as the enemy's prowling around the world, seeking whom he can devour, God says, what are you doing? He's like, oh, I'm just roaming the earth. I'm looking for who I can hassle. And God says, have you considered my servant Job? That was only like 20 words after we hear Job was blameless and upright.
Right.
And what I take from that story is consistent with what Jesus told us in the New Testament. In this life, you will experience trials, but take heart because I have overcome the world. I look at Job and I think Job was blameless and upright, meaning he didn't cause anything. There was no sin in his life that God was angry about. God was not punishing him. And yet Job experienced physical pain with sores on his body, emotional pain, relationship pain. Even his wife said, Job, why don't you curse God
and die?
He experienced financial pain. He lost all of his livestock and his servants. He experienced spiritual pain because he's like, God, I cursed the day I was even born. And then he experienced secondary pain because his good, well-intentioned friends, after about 7 days of putting up with his grief, then started saying, Job, this is your fault. This is why you have pain. This is what you need to do. So Job experienced all the types of pain that I talk about in the hem of his garment, but it wasn't his fault. But we live in a fallen world. And he asked why. I personally have never found it very helpful to ask God why. And frequently in scripture, when people ask God why, that's not the question he answers. God often answers the question that he knows we really need the answer to. And what Job really needed to know was he needed to see how great God was, how awesome God was, and how God is in control of everything. So at the end of that book, we find Job saying, wow, I saw you before, but I know you now.
Right. Yeah,
And
that's
that's what we have
beautiful.
to hold on to. I think people say things frequently, Laurie, because, well, first of all, because they're uncomfortable with our pain
For
and they want
sure.
to try to make themselves feel less uncomfortable. And then other times I think they say things not realizing the impact it's going to have on the pain sufferer because they think it's going to help. So, as the pain sufferer, one of the challenges is for us not to pick up a spirit of offense when people suggest those things to us, but to go in prayer and say, Lord, is there anything that I've done that might have brought this on or opened the door to the enemy? Are there lies that I'm believing that exacerbate my pain? But
Right.
when we pick up a spirit of offense towards others, then we've got another layer of pain that we've got to deal with later. If we can just release them to Lord and realize hurt people, then we might be able to, even in our pain, have a moment of compassion for them.
That's a good word. I mean, and isn't that what Jesus did on the cross? I mean, he did ask a question, probably one of the hardest questions ever asked. My
Yes.
God, why have you forsaken me? But
Yes.
he didn't ask why me, which is kind of the question we
Right.
tend to default to. He said, why you, God?
Yeah.
And that's a little bit thornier territory, but I think God is big enough to take our question. Here's my personal view on it. I think God is big enough to take our questions.
Absolutely.
But to your point, pain is lonely. And when other people speak into it in a way that pricks either our pride or look, we're humbled, we're laid low already. So we're already in a weak place.
Right.
So I think just walking tight with God and letting him propel us through that and lead us through it rather than aiming our pain at other people.
And when Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? We don't use that language today, but I think the tenor of our heart is similar when we think, God, why have you abandoned me? God, why have you left me when I
Right.
need you the most? Why are you so silent? And I totally agree with you. God is big enough to handle our questions, but we have to be okay with the fact that he may not always answer the question that we ask, but he knows what we need to hear the most.
Right. So, Michelle, this is the risk you run by having a former journalist on your program. If it's okay, I have some questions in my head related not only to your upcoming book, The Hem of His Garment, but just overall to pain because I'm curious. It's just the curious side of me. So, could I ask you a few questions?
Sure, let's talk about it.
Okay. So you got around the edges of this before, but I'd really like to know your thoughts on how our mindset affects our pain.
Laurie, what we focus on tends to grow. In my own personal experience, when I focus on the physical pain, then that pain level seems to escalate and it's all I can think about. It becomes all encompassing. And it's a challenge then when that is my focus to get back to knowing what I know to do. Things like being in prayer and putting on my praise and worship music when maybe prayer is a little bit too daunting for me. There are times when pain is so bad, Laurie, that my prayer is simply, Jesus, help. And that's all I can pray.
Yeah.
But our mindset is so important because if we think and we start to believe this is all I'm ever going to amount to, I'm always going to struggle with this. God doesn't love me, or he would have taken my pain away. When those are the things we focus on, our pain will grow and we will start to retreat and we will start to isolate, even isolate from God. And that just is a very negative, self-defeating cycle that only makes our pain worse.
So you just said the word negative. So far in the context of pain, we really have talked about it as a negative, but I wonder if there's a positive side to pain that we could explore a little bit. That's a weird question, but maybe you know where I'm going.
But I understand where you're coming from, and I'm glad that you're asking that question, because pain, by and large, is very negative. But I've also learned to appreciate some of the positive aspects. Like, the biggest one is that pain usually indicates that there is something wrong.
Pain points the way.
It does. So in the case of chronic physical pain, yesterday I went out to go for a walk and I had this sharp pain going up my leg, and I thought, well, that's unusual. I've never had that before. And so it alerted me that there was something going on in my body. But relationship pain indicates there's something going on in me or another person or our relationship together that needs to be addressed. Emotional pain lets me know that there's something that I'm ruminating about or thinking about or spending a lot of time on that needs to be addressed. And spiritual pain, we've got to get back to addressing what's blocking our relationship and forming our beliefs about God. But pain also alerts us to faulty thinking.
What do you
Pain
mean by
often,
that?
it often tends to be an all or nothing type scenario. We are either great or we're awful. We're either always going to be this way or we're never going to be this way. And so if we can take the time to assess, what thought patterns am I having and what track am I going down to, that gives us an opportunity to course correct. But pain also highlights our lack of control. Frequently, pain sufferers are in a situation, especially with chronic physical pain, where we've tried all the things to make the pain go away and it's not working.
Right.
And ultimately, then it's up to God. And God wants us so dependent. That's the other positive about pain, is that it reveals our dependence on God. I don't know if this is true about you, Laurie, but when things are going great, I don't feel like I need God as much. And it's not even always a conscious decision. It's more of I go about my day.
Right.
Until something bad hits. And then I go, wait a minute, I can't handle this. Whereas pain kind of reminds us God always wants us to be dependent on him.
Yeah, that does really, I think you probably saw a reaction from me on that. That really does resonate with me. And I think the other thing that pain has accomplished in my life, pain's a great teacher. I think one of the other things is it's made me a lot less black and white in how I relate to other people. And by that I mean the pre-pain Laurie, let's go back 15 years ago. I don't know if you would have liked her very much. She was pretty black and white. You know, your knees hurt, lose weight. Your marriage is struggling, work on it. And life is just never that black and white. And pain has really, physical pain has really tenderized me to be able to navigate situations in relationships that require empathy with a greater level of empathy. I mean, this Laurie hurts more often, but I like her a whole lot better.
That may be one of the greatest gifts that I've experienced through my own pain and suffering, whether it was through physical pain or emotional pain or relationship pain. I have much more true compassion for the suffering of others. And I'm more likely to extend the benefit of the doubt, assuming that there may be something going on that I'm not aware of. Because in our pain, we tend to respond differently to other people.
Right.
And so I'm more sensitive to somebody might be experiencing something and I'm just not aware, because I
That's
walk
right.
around frequently and people aren't aware that I'm in pain.
So we've talked kind of about how pain can impact our earthly relationships. Could I ask you about something I have struggled with, and I think many of your listeners and viewers may have as well, and that is when chronic pain will not relent. How can we, what's your best advice on how to navigate our relationship with the Lord through that? How do we not lose trust in him or hope in him?
I wasn't always this way, so I certainly don't want to lend the impression that I've got it all figured out. But I have come to appreciate that God has given us the gift of lament. Now, I used to equate lament with complaining, but I've learned that there's a subtle difference. God doesn't like complaining. And honestly, I don't like to be around people who complain. And so I really shrink back. And sometimes when I should share my pain, I don't, because I err on the side of I don't want to complain. But complaining is very me focused, and it's rooted in pride. Complaining is based on what I think I deserve. God, I don't like this, and I want you to take it away. Whereas lament is biblical, and lament is the opportunity to express our personal despair or our loss. And yet it is couched within an appeal to the character of God and the expected presence of God. Now, they may or may not include an explicit statement of need, but prayers of lament both look at unresolved issues. So, God, I'm dealing with this. God, I'm struggling with this. And they reflect a prior experience of recognizing God's presence and his character and his provision. It's like when we read in the Psalms, why so downcast, O my soul? Like, that's a very honest, gut-wrenching, here's where I'm at. But then we hear David say, and yet I put my trust in you. I've come to really appreciate that pain is part of this world. I don't think it was God's intent, but we live in a fallen world, and God gives us the choice how we're going to respond in pain. And when pain is so bad, and I have been to that place before, Laurie, where the pain was so bad, I wasn't sure that if God didn't take it away, that I wanted to continue. That's a really dark place.
That's a hard thing to say out loud, and I'm glad you said it, because I've been there in my head too. And I think sometimes we want to, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting your point, but that is something that Christians are not supposed to say out loud, but it's real and we feel it. And you can bet David felt it too when he was hiding in caves from a madman.
And there was a place in the book, you might consider it sacrilegious, but I said in the hem of his garment, when the pain gets that bad, there are times that even though I know Jesus suffered way, way, way more than I will ever suffer, please hear that. His suffering was greater than I will ever experience. But when my physical pain is that bad, there have been times when I've thought, but Jesus was lucky. He knew when the end of his ministry was going to be. For a lot of pain sufferers, we don't know if or when we will ever receive healing this side of heaven. Now, that is not meant to minimize Jesus's suffering. It's just meant to show the depth of the despair that the chronic pain sufferer goes through. But it's also, for me, I've had to learn this is in part what it means to partake in Christ's suffering. He came to earth, he humbled himself, and he became a man to feel all the feels, including our physical pain. And so when it comes to your question of how do you hold on to your faith in the midst of pain, part of it is remembering I'm not in this alone. Jesus really can relate because he experienced all the kinds of pain that I will ever go through. And that makes me appreciative of the sacrifice he made for me, whether I get my healing this side of heaven or not.
Yeah, that's good.
Laurie Davies and I were having such an important, content rich discussion about when chronic pain becomes too much that I just didn't want to stop the conversation. So we've decided that we will make this a 2-part episode. So I hope that what you heard so far has piqued your interest, offered you some hope and encouragement, and encouraged you to join us for part 2 of when chronic pain becomes too much next week. We'll be back with you next week for the rest of the conversation between Laurie Davies and I about when chronic pain becomes too much. We'll see you then.